Welcome back to the Fearless Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and in today's episode, we're going to be looking at the 97th Oscars award ceremony. It's received quite the buzz here on the internet. We're going to look at Hollywood and their attitudes towards the Jewish lived experience, what was said about anti-Semitism and what wasn't said about anti-Semitism, as well as Hollywood's policy prescription towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. No Other Land won Best Documentary, and there's a lot to be said about even the acceptance speech by its directors and their condemnation of President Trump's support for Israel in its fight against Hamas. But I think this year's award ceremony has to say a lot more than just Hollywood's attitudes towards anti-Semitism, the Jewish lived experience, and the war between Israel and Hamas. It highlights kind of a tipping point in culture here in the West and in America. Hollywood has doubled down on its critical theory ideology, its radical far-left ideas, which it has been pushing on the American populace and the West for well over a decade. Policy is downstream of culture, and Hollywood is the cultural bearer. They transmit culture, they create culture, and they have been pushing this far-left critical theory agenda for a long time. But the recent election in 2024 highlights that the American populace has said no more. And this year's dip in viewership for the Oscar awards ceremony indicates that the American populace has said the left has gone too far. Ideologically, they're rejecting critical theory when it comes to feminism, race theory, gender theory. But this year's awards ceremony highlighted that Hollywood doesn't quite get it. They continue to push this dangerous ideology because they have the privilege of living outside of its consequences. Hollywood is the last to feel the repercussions of poor economic policy, immigration policy, international policy. They have wealth, they have names, they have the best educations in the world, and they have some of the richest zip codes. And because of that, they don't experience the trickle-down repercussions of the ideas that they push, including when it comes to anti-Semitism and the war in Israel against Hamas. So we're going to look at the cultural moment and what it means for the Judeo-Christian West and the Antichrist narrative that was on display at this year's award ceremony. All this and more upcoming in this episode. I hope you enjoy. So this year's Oscar awards ceremony saw a huge decline in viewership by 7%, which is quite significant because the Oscars have been dealing with a decline in viewership for the last decade more. But they had seen kind of an uptick over the last 4 years. Here is a graph showing that. We see a huge decline kind of starting in 2014, which is when a lot of the critical theory ideologies that Hollywood has been peddling through film and through media and just through these actors being influencers themselves for the last decade plus. I think this year was important because for the first time in a really long time, the American populace has said enough's enough to Hollywood. And we're seeing Hollywood in real time have to grapple with the reality that, first off, your average American rejects their far left ideology. But second off, that they themselves as influencers, as cultural icons, have also lost their influence and power over your average American. And that's never been more evident than in this last presidential election with President Trump winning not just the Electoral College, but also the popular vote. And President Trump, whether you like the man or you don't like the man, he represents something larger than himself. It's a rejection of the establishment, which also includes the Hollywood establishment, because Hollywood elites are comfortable morally posturing to the rest of society because they themselves live privileged lives that are never affected by detrimental economic, social, or immigration policy. And we also have seen Hollywood undermine Judeo-Christian values in the West, which I think is extremely detrimental. Again, policy is always downstream of culture. And we've seen a huge concerted effort to undermine Christian values over the last, again, decade plus. But this year, something else I think is important to note, which is the silence, yet again, as with the 2024 Oscars, about anti-Semitism here in the United States There's been huge support again this year for the Palestinian cause, or at least sympathy, as well as failure to condemn Hamas. That's evident by both The Brutalist winning Best Actor and No Other Land winning Best Documentary. We'll look at both of those in a second. But I think we're in a moment where Hollywood is realizing that they have met their ideological end, and yet they continue to double down. Over the last few award ceremonies, including the Grammys and the Golden Globes, many of these celebrities have used their acceptance speeches as a platform to condemn the rest of society. And it reminds me a lot of the Hunger Games and the Capitol versus the average person, and that the Capitol always had the privilege of never having to live the experience of the average person in a district. And they found the struggle of the average person to be a form of entertainment. And I think that's pretty similar in Hollywood as well. Something we're going to observe just throughout this episode is that anti-Semitism, war and conflict, even sex work with Honora winning Best Actress is something that Hollywood fetishizes. They marvel over the plight of your average person because they themselves get to go back to their lives of privilege. And I think that's why we've seen Hollywood take a very sympathetic stance to the Palestinian cause since the start of the war, and their failure to condemn October 7th or call for the hostages to be released, because it doesn't fit into the oppressor-oppressed paradigm that Hollywood is pushing. Again, we see this reflected throughout all of culture, on college campuses. It's all intertwined. It's all part of one larger ecosystem. So let's look at Adrien Brody's acceptance speech for The Brutalist. The Brutalist is a film that follows the life of a Jewish man leaving post-war-torn World War II Central Europe to come to the United States, and he becomes a prominent architect. But his acceptance speech, I think, is extremely telling of where Hollywood is comfortable speaking about anti-Semitism, which is in a very short statement sandwiched between a long list of other isms.
To represent the lingering traumas and the repercussions of war and systematic oppression and of anti-Semitism and racism and of othering. And I believe that I pray for a healthier and a happier and a more inclusive world. And I believe if the past...
Ben Shapiro also points this out on his podcast, but he sandwiches anti-Semitism literally in the middle of systemic oppression, racism. I think he even says other isms, and hope of a peaceful world. Because again, he's privileged and he can just hope for peace, because even if peace isn't achieved, it doesn't really affect him. But this would have been the perfect movie to platform anti-Semitism still happening today. But again, Hollywood only wants to make films that follow the triumph of the Jewish experience, because honestly, it's the perfect narrative. The Jewish lived experience throughout all of history is one of triumph. It makes for some of the best on-screen stories. But that's where it ends. They don't want to talk about what that means for real life. And they'll speak out against hate and systemic oppression in so long as it's towards a Jewish individual, and then they're largely silent. And you can hear the trepidation in his voice. He kind of pauses before he says anti-Semitism, which I think is just absolutely crazy. So now let's look at No Other Land. No Other Land is an extremely controversial documentary. It is very left-leaning. It condemns Israel as an authoritarian or military regime. And it follows the lives of Palestinians living in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, from an extremely, as I said, leftist worldview. The film fails to acknowledge radical Islamism, the support of Hamas by large swaths of Palestinian populations in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And it presents the hindrance to peace for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as being the fault of, again, the Israeli regime. And the director for the film, or one of the co-directors, literally calls it, the Israeli government, the only democracy in the Middle East, he calls it on the Oscar stage a regime, which is absolutely insane and very, very pointed on his end. That word was not used by accident.
Our voices are stronger. We see each other. The atrocious destruction of Gaza and its people, which must end. The Israeli hostages brutally taken in the crime of October 7th, which must be freed. When I look at Bassel, I see my brother, but we are unequal.
Okay, so he does mention the hostages, but very, very briefly. And he doesn't condemn Hamas. He just calls it a brutal crime. But a crime is different than something that's systemic, right? Or has the hopes of being something larger, like a genocide, like wiping out Jews from the river to the sea. So calling it a crime, which it was a crime against humanity, but kind of glossing over it, I think writes it off as like a one-off. And that's convenient for this film because then they don't have to acknowledge the dangerous Islamist ideologies of Hamas and the sympathy Hamas has by the general population in Gaza. Because again, for a film promoting pluralism and living peacefully next to each other, in order to get there, Islamism and Hamas's ideology has to be delegitimized and eradicated. Presenting it as only the Israelis' fault is disingenuous, and it's a fantasy, just like every other movie that is put out by Hollywood. This would have been the perfect time in Yuval Abrams' speech to mention that one of the volunteers for the documentary, Hayam Katzman, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, died on October 7th in Holit. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to get him up on the screen for you. He died in Holit on October 7th. This would have been the moment to acknowledge his work on the film and to remember his life. And he has not been mentioned one time post-Oscar award ceremonies. His story broke, like I saw this on Instagram, but there's not even a mainstream platform that has talked about it, which I think is absolutely horrendous. He was a volunteer on the film. He was a peace activist. He held a PhD. When he was dying, he saved 3 other people. He's everything that the Hollywood left, the social justice movement in Hollywood, should love. A peace activist, someone who was volunteering for this film. He felt so passionately about the mission for pluralism and Palestinian statehood that he volunteered on the film. And he is one of many peace activists that on October 7th were killed. Many of the kibbutzim in the South were peace-loving communities, some of them even being socialist-leaning, very left-leaning in their ideology, not religious, were the communities that were targeted. And they were targeted because many of these kibbutzim brought in Palestinian workers to help on the kibbutz, which is why many of the terrorists knew on October 7th exactly which homes to go to, because for years they took meticulous and methodical notes because they were premeditating the slaughter of the people who had opened their kibbutzim up to them to create peace and to create coexistence. It's heinous and it's horrific. And for the film No Other Land to fail to mention that, which is the biggest hindrance to Palestinian statehood and coexistence next to an Israeli state, is intellectually dishonest. And as I mentioned, it's a fantasy, just like everything else Hollywood puts out. But we saw a lot of other morally depraved things at this year's Oscar Awards ceremony. And the reason I want to point it out, even though this podcast isn't necessarily about American culture or about immigration policy or about domestic politics for the sake of any of those things, but it points to Hollywood's concerted effort to undermine the West and truth, capital T, and Judeo-Christian values. And again, I think that's why they absolve themselves from having to speak out about Israel, because they've bought into a postmodern alternative universe, which sees everything through an oppressor-oppressed paradigm. Everything we've seen on college campuses over the last year and a half originated both in academia and then also in Hollywood, transmitted through film, but also through the influence of these actors and actresses. Before I get to that, though, I do also want to point out that there were protests outside the Oscars. Yeah, that's enough. But the reason I wanted to highlight that too before we moved on is that all these protesters are like all white. They're all white, privileged Californians who are protesting outside the Oscars. It's a pretty small crowd. Again, the Oscars this year, very few of the actors showed up wearing any visible memorabilia supporting the Palestinian cause. If you remember last year, I think Guy Pearce was the only one who wore a pin saying Free Palestine this year. Last year, the Oscars, a lot of actors adorned or attendees adorned red pins. Again, Hollywood's policy window for social justice issues is very short, only when it's beneficial to them and it makes them feel good to speak out about the oppression of certain people groups. But the protest outside the Oscars this year is a bunch of privileged white people, and they make like these pretty signs, and then they go home and they feel better. It's part of their salvation and their secular religion and their postmodern world. If you don't have something to live for, if, for example, as a Christian, if you don't have Christ to sanctify you, then your social justice activism is that sanctification. And we see Hollywood echo this. So these protesters on the street are a symptom of the larger echo chamber that Hollywood has created, which again, we saw portrayed throughout this entire awards ceremony. I want to point out the acceptance speech for Best Actress by Mikey Madison. She played in a film called Honora. Honora is a film about a sex worker who's brutalized. I have not seen the film. I have heard that it kind of glorifies sex, even when she's being brutalized in a very uncomfortable way. But I want to point to Hollywood's use of sexuality, including LGBTQ plus rights, as a vehicle to undermine Western values. So let's watch her speech first.
I also just want to again recognize and honor the sex worker community. I will continue to support and be an ally. All of the incredible people, the women that I've had the privilege of meeting from that community has been.
Okay, sex worker community. Hollywood cheered like she was thanking the cops of America or our US military or teachers in America or even the LA firefighters. It's like the fact that Hollywood's cheering for the sex worker community when most women are either forced into sex trafficking or their life and situation economically or socially has forced them into selling their bodies because it is their last resort, whether they didn't have an education, whether they're socially disenfranchised, whether or not they think that's all they can turn to. This idea that like female sexuality, which is very post third wave feminism, fourth wave feminism, is liberating and glamorous, has also been pushed by the advent of OnlyFans and even Hollywood kind of romanticizing female sexuality. But they're fetishizing the plight of women throughout all of history. Sex work is quite literally one of the oldest professions for women. And it has been one that most women turn to once impoverished. And so celebrating it like it's romantic, I think, is one of the grossest displays of privilege I've seen at the Oscars in a really long time. But I think it segues perfectly into Amelia Perez, because this year's nominations for Amelia Perez, I want to say it was nominated for 13 Oscars, which is like tied for the most Oscars nominated for any film ever. I could be wrong on those numbers. If I am, let me know in the comment section down below. But all you need to know is it was nominated in almost every category it could have been nominated for. And the film follows a transgender male to female who was once the head of a murderous drug cartel in Mexico. And he seeks to use a transition to female as Amelia Perez to fake his death and live a new life away from the crime and the gang of the drug cartels in Mexico. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because it is the most antichrist narrative that you could have in a film. Amelia Perez's sins as a murderous, brutal drug cartel leader is absolved because he transitions to a female to live his authentic self and pursue a wholesome career as an opera singer. So the story of the Bible is we are absolved of our sins through salvation in Christ and through dying to our sin. So in that we are transformed. For the secular left, for the postmodern left, again, because there is no Christ or a mechanism for salvation or cleansing ourselves of our sin, Hollywood turns to sin itself as the vehicle for redemption. And so Amelia Perez is absolved of her murderous past as a drug cartel leader in receiving a sex change. It is the inverse of the biblical narrative. And again, we also see Hollywood fetishizing the drug cartels in Mexico and singing about the drug cartels, because Emilia Perez is a dark comedy film that's also a musical. And if you want a glimpse into how depraved the film is, here's an excerpt of one of the songs.
Vaginoplasty, yes. Rhinoplasty, yes. Laryngo. Nice to meet you. I'd like to know about sex change operation. I see. Men to woman, or woman to men. Man to woman. From penis to vagina. Vaginoplasty, yes. Rhinoplasty, yes. Laryngoplasty, yes. Mammoplasty, yes. Vaginoplasty, yes. Rhinoplasty, yes. Laryngoplasty, yes. Control laryngoplasty. What is that? Adam's apple reduction. Yes.
It's freaky. It's like a fever dream. It's disgusting. And it's just morally depraved. And the rest of the American populace, international viewers also felt the same way, because Emilia Perez, although it's been acclaimed as one of the most nominated films by the Academy, got a 16% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. I love this one comment. It says, "This is why the Dems lost." And I want to contrast that with Wicked, because Emilia Perez won for Best Musical against Wicked at the Golden Globes, which Wicked had a 95% approval rating by the general Rotten Tomatoes audience. It was a cultural phenomenon last year. You couldn't go anywhere without hearing Wicked, seeing, Wicked displayed at your grocery store. It was on cereal boxes. It was on, makeup campaigns. There was Barbies. Wicked was like the theme of 2024. And instead of, living in a meritocracy, the Academy and the Oscars nominate films based off of if they meet DEI criteria. This is the criteria that you must meet in order to even be nominated for an Oscar by the Academy. It reads as like a DEI checklist, which Emilia Perez as a film also reads as like a DEI checklist. It's English and Spanish, so it has the racial component, being set in Mexico, even though none of the actors are Mexican. And it also has the transgender agenda in there as well with LGBTQ+. So in order for a film to be nominated at the Oscars, it has to, 1, have a lead or significant supporting role represent an underrepresented racial or ethnic group. And they list out what that can be: African American or Black, Asian, Hispanic, Middle Eastern. Then the subcategory of that, 30% of all actors, like your whole cast, have to represent 2 of the underrepresented groups, including women, racial or ethnic group, LGBTQ+, or people with cognitive or physical disabilities, or who are deaf or hard of hearing. So throughout a meritocracy, throughout filmmaking for the sake of filmmaking, now filmmaking is no longer art for the sake of art. It is art for the sake of propaganda and for the sake of ideology. And this is why the Oscars are silent on anti-Semitism. This is why the Oscars have to condemn Israel publicly. And this is why the Oscar ratings have dipped so significantly, not just in the last few years, just over the last decade plus. Because again, policy is downstream of culture. Everything we felt during the last presidential administration was because of what was happening in Hollywood a decade and a half beforehand. That's why we see what's happening on college campuses. Culture sets the tone for policy. And we have to call out these Hollywood elites, either publicly or just by not giving them our views, which I think the drop in 7% viewership this year is a very strong signal to Hollywood that their influence is waning. But specifically as Christians who support the Judeo-Christian West, we have to speak out against the evil. I know evil is like a really loaded word, but it's an evil agenda in Hollywood. And again, these elites are privileged to live outside of the consequences of the ideas that they push. And with that, I will leave you guys for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope next year you boycott the 98th Oscar Award ceremony. Have a good one, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks so much for watching this week's episode of the Fearless Project podcast. The Fearless Project podcast is an educational offering of the Fearless Project, which is a nonprofit. If you feel so led to give to educational offerings such as these, please consider giving in the giving link down below. Like always, like, comment, and subscribe. And please follow us on all of our social media outlets, including X and Instagram, for shorter form commentary on social issues such as this. I'll see you in the next episode.